everyone, I am back in my office this week. I am following the sun around my house and it's been a difficult day and I wasn't going to do the alternative academia video today. I've decided to push on with it because sometimes I feel like if it's on my list, I just need to do it no matter how crap I'm feeling. So just bear with me. I've chosen the hardest chapter of my thesis to talk about in this video, despite having a bit of a challenging day. So this could be interesting. I'm looking over here because this is where my notes are. I also just wanted to say that I haven't really connected with this process. I really enjoyed blogging, although I just felt like I didn't have enough time to blog. And I really liked doing the images, but I just found I wasn't really interesting enough to take pictures week to week. But with video blogging, I'm not sure if it's because I don't have an audience or because I don't feel prepared enough despite writing notes. There's just something about this process that hasn't really worked for me. I'm going to keep doing it because it's part of my alternative academia challenge to do this. But I just wanted to put that out there, that sometimes things don't work out and that's just the way they are. Anyway, so today I wanted to do a quick video on the fourth chapter of my findings. I have 5 findings chapters. You would expect next week for me to do chapter 5, but chapter 5 is still in revision. So I'm probably not going to talk about chapter 5 next week. I think I might just do a video on sort of PhD life next week. But this week I'm going to talk about chapter 4. Now this is probably the most complex chapter of my findings, and it's about the structural and cultural influences of implementing neurodiversity into the police organisation. Now even the title sounds a little bit scary, but to break that down I kind of found 3 themes. So the first one is quite a simple one, which is that neurodiversity in the police organisations that I worked with wasn't a priority. Neurodiversity wasn't a priority in those police forces. That doesn't necessarily mean that the police didn't care about neurodiversity, and obviously the participants who came forward in my research had an interest in neurodiversity, but that's not to say that there were others that wouldn't have been interested in it or in the support of autistic people or people with ADHD or anything like that. People have their individual interests. However, in terms of a structural priority in the police, neurodiversity wasn't one. And I think a lot of that was to do with money and resources that are put into these things. So police organisations are sort of governed by police and crime commissioners. Now, they put a lot of their money into vulnerable people. Now, there is an argument to suggest that neurodivergent people aren't vulnerable. Or that they're vulnerable they're made vulnerable by their environment, but they themselves are not vulnerable, and therefore the money and resources tend to go to other vulnerable categories, such as the elderly or children or people that are more obviously vulnerable. Therefore, the money kind of goes into that, and therefore the priorities are then structured around the money and resources that are afforded to it. And it becomes like a cycle, and I actually describe this in the thesis, that it's a cyclic nature. Unfortunately, the thing I did find was that another priority for the police in terms of diversity, and not for vulnerability, was that ethnicity still seems to be kind of their focus, which I personally find a bit outdated. I'm not sure that is the right way forward. I think that neurodiversity, not because it's up and coming, but that ethnicity is kind of been there, done that. Although that's not to say that the police still have problems in that department. Anyway, moving on from diversity, because I'll end up digging a hole. Another influence, but in a similar vein to this, was the role of managers and management. So again, a structural influence over the implementation of neurodiversity. Managers had a say in whether officers could go out and conduct any individual work that they wanted to in regards to neurodiversity. So therefore, some were allowed that flexibility to do that based on what their managers said, and others weren't. Therefore, this finding suggests that neurodiversity, when it's introduced, or how it's introduced, should come from the top down, which typically is not seen as a good thing. It sometimes be, when things are bottom up, they're more organic, they're more interesting, they're usually a little more valid, and people want to do that. But for, sorry, my husband's just walked in. I'm doing my video blog, sorry. When it's bottom up and it's more organic, those things may tend to stick a little better. But actually, I don't think that was the case in this research. I think it needed to come from management, not forcing it down the necks per se, but just it had to be a whole structural thing rather than just individual people going off and doing their own initiatives. Not to say that it wasn't great when they were allowed to do that by their managers. As such, culture comes into this a lot, and it's a really significant part of my thesis. And one of the questions that I was really spurred by when I started this process was, how does a potentially neurotypical police force support neurodivergent people? Surely there should be some sort of clash there, just as there's a clash with the sort of top-down, bottom-up management styles, just as there is when neurodiversity isn't considered a priority. However, I found that that question was too simple, and that the situation is a lot more complex than that. So although I found there are definitely still some roots of the kind of culturally cynical cops, or as one participant describes it, they're still stuck in their ways, it wasn't as bad or as rigid as I maybe first presumed it would be. For example, I'll give you an example. So one of the core cultural characteristics that is mentioned in the literature by Rayner is suspicion, and that the police are naturally suspicious of people who are different, people who are showing perhaps some sort of criminality, which arguably a neurodivergent person could be because of their divergence. However, what I found in this research was that their suspicion was actually fueled by other people. So for example, if the public rang in and said, this person's acting a bit odd, they might be drunk, they might be on drugs, and therefore that would affect the way that the police went into a situation. But not to say that the police had that suspicion in the first place. They tended to be a lot more open-minded entering a situation. And there were other examples where they weren't as rigid. I mean, even in the fact that police officers would go out of their own way to develop their own initiatives suggests that there is definitely more open box thinking than the core cultural characteristics would suggest. There are definitely people who don't fit that stereotypical mould. So therefore, to conclude this little segment of me talking about this chapter, change is coming, but it's coming slowly. And I've been thinking about the word reform a lot in the last few days as I'm trying to write my discussion chapter. And actually, I'm not sure whether this is about reforming police culture or reforming a police organisation for the purpose of neurodiversity. I'm actually not sure that neurodiversity is even there in the first place to reform. I think this is something that's going to have to be introduced, and the way that we introduce it is going to be integral to how it sticks and how it's treated throughout the ranks, by managers, by priority setters like the PCCs, and that's it. Yeah. That's chapter 4 in a very small nutshell. This is the biggest findings chapter, so to say that I've done that in 9 minutes is quite impressive. It's I think it's about 15,000 words, this chapter. It's definitely one of my longest. It could be even longer than that, to be honest, and it's definitely the most complex. There's a lot of back and forth with this one, but I think it's found some really interesting things. So there's 3 top things to take from that is that neurodiversity is not a priority for police organisations. It might be for police officers, but it's not for police organisations unless they consider neurodiversity to be a vulnerability, which isn't always just necessarily the case. The second point is the influence of managers. Now, if you're a manager, you might want to take this away, that you have a massive influence on your officers. And if you're forcing something down their necks, they're not going to take that. But if you find management a management leadership way of working, a co-productive way of working where you play on people's strengths. One participant mentioned it being like a football team, and that everybody knew what they were good at, and the supervisor, the sergeant, would take advantage of that. And that's why he ended up going off and doing like the neurodiversity thing, but then he'd come back and feed that into his team, and that worked really well. So just be mindful of that. And thirdly, culture, which is a huge thing, and I've probably not done it any justice in this little ramble. But I think this is a much more complex situation than just neurotypical police force and how they support neurodivergent people. It's not like we're talking about the predominantly white police force and how that influences their support of Black people, though it's a similar concept. It tends to be a little bit more complicated than that. Therefore, we perhaps need to look at different cultural models as opposed to just core characteristics. And instead you could look at sort of the toolkit approach, where culture is something that can be used and applied rather than something that is and is very standard that everybody has. I don't think it's a blanket that all officers have, otherwise we wouldn't ever get anything new or innovative, which is a word that I can't really say very well. So that's it for this week. As I say, next week I'm not going to be talking about chapter 5 because it's not finished. When it is finished, I may write a blog. I probably won't do this because as I've said, I've not really enjoyed this video blogging process. But I will come on next week and have a little chat, maybe just about doing a PhD. I've been quite inspired recently by a lot of PhD students talking about mental health. So maybe I will do a little video on that. And we're bordering on 12 minutes, so I'm gonna go. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Stay well.